There is something about Florida that teaches you not to look too closely at the water. You drive past the drainage canal behind the subdivision every morning, past the golf course lagoon, past the pond at the edge of the retention basin, and you do not think about what might be floating just beneath the surface. That is not carelessness. It is a kind of treaty the whole state seems to have signed. But that water is darker than you realize, and something in it does not belong on this continent. 3 Nile crocodiles have been pulled from South Florida waters, not from the Everglades, not from some remote wildlife management area, but from canals and residential neighborhoods where people live. Genetic testing traced all 3 back to wild populations in South Africa. All 3 carried identical DNA, which means they came from the same source. Nobody knows how many more are still out there, uncounted. So here's the question we are going to follow, and it does not have a clean answer. How did an African apex predator end up in Florida's backyards in the first place? And how many more of them might already be out there, uncounted? Before we start, if this is the kind of story that keeps your mind turning after dark, go ahead and subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps the channel. On a routine survey in a South Florida canal, a team of biologists pulled something from the water that the field guide said could not be there. It was a juvenile crocodile, but the snout was wrong. The scale pattern was wrong. The temperament, even as they handled it, was wrong. The mind reaches for a stray alligator the way it reaches for a stray dog. Familiar category, safe explanation. You see a log-shaped reptile in Florida water, and your brain slots it into the only box it has. Alligator, native, manageable. But the biologists who pulled it from the water knew immediately that this was not an alligator. This was Crocodilus niloticus, the Nile crocodile, the species that kills more people per year in Africa than every American predator combined. Not by accident, not when provoked, as a matter of routine. Genetic testing confirmed what the snout shape already told them. This animal's DNA traced back to wild populations in South Africa, and it did not match any Nile crocodile sampled from an American zoo. Where exactly it had come from, a permitted breeder, an unlicensed collector, nobody could say for certain. Here is the denial. People tell themselves it was a single escaped pet. Case closed. Nothing to see. Someone's exotic reptile got loose, it happens. Move along. But the animals never signed that agreement. This canal capture was not the only one. Between 2009 and 2014, biologists pulled 3 separate Nile crocodiles out of South Florida waters. One came out of a canal. One turned up in the Everglades during a wildlife survey. One was found relaxing on the porch of a house in Miami, as if it lived there. 3 different years, 3 different corners of South Florida. All 3 genetically identical to one another. So, how many are out there? That is where the story stops being a curiosity and starts being something else. Only 3 of these animals have ever been confirmed. That is the number on the record. But Kenneth Crisco, the collection manager who worked the case, put it plainly. If we're being realistic, we don't know how many were there to start with. 3 is not a population count. It's just the number that happened to get caught. Think about what that number means. Not the total population estimate, which nobody has. Nobody knows how many Nile crocodiles are swimming through South Florida right now. But the confirmed captures. The ones pulled out of canals and ponds within a few miles of residential neighborhoods. That number alone was enough to change how the agency talked about the problem. But the Nile crocodile is not the alligator. It is longer. It is faster. It has a bite force strong enough to crush bone, and it uses that force every time, cornered or not. An alligator bites to hold. A Nile crocodile bites to kill, and it does not let go. And the places they keep pulling them out are not remote swamp. They are the drainage canal behind the strip mall, the retention pond behind the new housing development, the golf course water hazard. The same water features that every Florida subdivision has, The ones with the decorative fountains and the signs that say no swimming. The distance between a Nile crocodile and a child's ankles in a backyard pool is not measured in miles anymore. It is measured in feet. It is measured in the width of a retaining wall. It is measured in the seconds it takes an animal that evolved to ambush prey from the water's edge to cover that gap. That question of how many leads straight into a harder one. What kind of animal are we even talking about? Because the animal showing up in Florida is not just another crocodilian. It is something the state has never had to deal with before. Here's the fact that sets the Nile crocodile apart from every other large reptile in North America. It evolved alongside humans for millions of years, not as prey, but as something that learned to hunt them. That is not a small difference. It is the difference between an animal that tolerates your presence and an animal that has spent its entire evolutionary history reading your behavior for weakness. American alligators are shy. They retreat. They avoid. They bite only when cornered or defending nests. You can walk within a few feet of a basking alligator and it will slide into the water and disappear. That is the deal Florida struck with the alligator generations ago. Leave it alone and it leaves you alone. The Nile crocodile does not retreat. It does not avoid. It treats the shoreline as a feeding zone and anything that enters the water as a potential meal. In Africa, they take people from boats, from riverbanks, from the edge of a watering hole at dusk, and they do it with a speed that leaves no time for the people nearby to process what happened. 1 second, someone is standing at the water's edge. The next second, the water is still and they are gone. The aggression is not incidental. It is the species' survival strategy. A Nile crocodile that lets a potential meal walk away does not pass on its genes. The ones that survived in Africa for millions of years are the ones that treated every opportunity as urgent. That instinct did not switch off when the first hatchlings arrived in Florida. Florida now has a breeding population of an animal that views humans as food, and it does that as standard behavior, not as some rare exception when cornered. And unlike the alligator, which the state knows how to manage, this species is new enough that nobody has a playbook yet. The techniques that work for alligators do not necessarily work for Nile crocodiles. The safe distances are different. The response times are different. The outcome of an encounter is different. Which raises the obvious question. If nobody released them intentionally in large numbers, how did they get here in the first place? Nile crocodiles came into Florida 2 ways, and both are on the record. Some arrived through the exotic pet trade, imported as shoebox-sized hatchlings that grew into 6-foot animals owners no longer wanted, and eventually got dumped in the nearest canal. Others escaped from an educational facility in South Florida that had been breeding Nile crocodiles in captivity, a handful getting loose by accident before wildlife officials traced the leak and the facility agreed to stop. Genetic work on captured specimens shows a narrow diversity. That means a small founding population. A handful of animals, maybe fewer than a dozen, related closely enough that their genetic markers cluster tightly. That is what you would expect from a population that started with just a few individuals from the same source, whether that source was one collector or one facility with a broken fence. The real mystery starts after that. Nobody knows how many of those original animals were ever recovered. That's the problem Crisco keeps circling back to. You can't know if you caught them all until you know how many there were to begin with. So the question stops being where they came from. It becomes how many are still out there, and whether the ones still out there have found each other in the water. So if they are breeding, that changes everything. And the evidence that they are breeding arrived in a form nobody could argue with. The 3 confirmed Nile crocodiles were genetically identical to each other. That's not proof of a breeding population. It's proof of a narrow founding group, all tracing back to one source, whether that's a single clutch, a single shipment, or one collector's stock that got loose all at once and scattered into the water. That distinction matters. And it's the one the researchers keep circling back to, even as the story spreads past them. Frank Mazzotti, a wildlife ecology professor at the University of Florida who worked the case, said flatly that it's unlikely these crocodiles will become an established population. They're not established or breeding or causing an impact, he said. There are stages of invasion, and by his account, Nile crocodiles in Florida have only cleared the first one. Escaped from captivity, found in the wild, nothing confirmed beyond that. And here's where the ambiguity refuses to resolve. Crisco doesn't share Mazzotti's confidence about how this ends, because he's the same researcher who already admitted nobody knows the size of the group that started this. Without that number, you can't rule out that some of them found each other in a canal system built for drainage, not containment, and did what crocodiles do when nobody's watching. 3 confirmed captures over 5 years isn't evidence of nothing. It's also not evidence of everything. The state is holding 2 facts that don't sit easily together. No confirmed reproduction in the wild, and no way to confirm the opposite either. Florida's caging requirements are strict enough that Kristen Summers, with the state's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, believes another mass escape is unlikely. But strict rules only stop the escapes people report. They do nothing about the ones nobody catches. And here's the detail that keeps Crisco's caution alive. The same study that identified these animals found that one of the 3 juveniles had grown nearly 28% faster than wild Nile crocodile juveniles from parts of their native range. Florida's water isn't just survivable for the species, it's favorable. Maybe more favorable than the rivers these animals evolved in. An animal that grows faster here than it does in Africa is an animal that's thriving, not just hanging on. Now we move from the question of whether they're breeding to the question of where they keep turning up. And that pattern is what makes this hard to dismiss. We are right at the halfway mark, and if you are still here, hit subscribe if you haven't yet. Because from here, the list stops being something you can walk away from. A Nile crocodile doesn't swim in from the ocean and climb up on a porch by accident. It moves through the same connected water, the canals and retention ponds and drainage systems that lace under every South Florida subdivision, running under golf courses, behind strip malls, along the back fence line of housing developments built in the last 20 years. All of it plumbed together like one continuous animal habitat nobody designed on purpose. The detection problem is what makes this hard to manage. A Nile crocodile and an American alligator look close enough from 30 feet away that most people never look twice. The alligator basks in the open. The Nile crocodile holds low and still, which only makes the misidentification easier. That's the real risk. Not one dramatic sighting, but a network of water nobody watches closely enough, wide enough for an animal that size to move through the state for years without anyone knowing exactly where it went. Go back to that Miami porch. Biologists found a Nile crocodile resting there like it belonged, and nobody on that property knew what they were looking at until a genetic test came back. It had already been living close enough to touch. Which leaves one final question, and it's the one the state is still trying to answer out loud. The State Wildlife Agency has a response protocol, but it's reactive. Capture when reported, remove when found, test when possible. That works for individual animals. It doesn't work for a population, and there's no systematic estimate of how many are out there, no eradication plan, no realistic way to search every canal and retention pond connected under South Florida. If you live near water in South Florida and spot a large reptile that doesn't look quite right, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission wants that reported, not assumed away as just another alligator. Somewhere in that network right now, in a canal behind a subdivision nobody thinks twice about, the water sits flat and still the way it always does. And whatever is under that surface has had over a decade to grow, in a climate that already made it grow faster than it ever did back home.